The lessee and the lessor should allocate the consideration in the contract over the lease and the non-lease components. That allocation is done based on the relative standalone prices of the lease components, and the aggregate standalone prices of the non-lease components. To figure out the standalone prices of a component, the lessee should refer to the price that the lessor, or a similar supplier, would charge for that component or a similar component separately. If a standalone price is not readily available, the lessee shall estimate the standalone price, maximizing the use of observable information. As for the lessor, the consideration in the contract is allocated, by applying the guidance in IFRS 15 for allocating the transaction price to performance obligations in the contract. So back to our showroom example in the previous lecture. These were the lease components that we identified in the contract in the previous example, the showroom and the kitchen, and we will account for them as one lease component because the separation conditions were not met for them as discussed in the previous lecture. Another lease component was the apartment, which will be accounted for as a single lease component, because the separation conditions were met for them. And the non-lease components were the security and maintenance components. Let us continue with the example. Assume that the contract term of the lease is 5 years, with a total consideration of $500,000, payable in annual installments of $100,000. This consideration includes the fees for the security and maintenance services in the contract. Also, the consideration included $5,000 for some administrative and legal activities, undertaken by the lessor in connection with the lease arrangement. After researching the market, the lessee was able to figure out the standalone prices for the showroom and the kitchen together and the apartment as $250,000 and $200,000 respectively, without the maintenance and security services. The security and maintenance services are provided in the market for $50,000 for each lease component. Allocate the consideration in the contract over the lease and non-lease component from the lessee's perspective. Let us start by inserting the standalone prices for these components. $250,000 for the showroom and the kitchen, and $200,000 for the apartment, then the aggregate standalone price for the security and maintenance, $100,000, calculated as $50,000 for each lease component as given in the example. The total for these standalone prices is $550,000. Let us compute the percentages for each component from the total standalone prices. 46% for the first component, 36% for the second component, 18% for the last component, and here is the total of these percentages, which should be 100%. Now multiply the consideration in the contract $500,000 by these percentages to get the share of each lease and non-lease component from the contract consideration. Our example stated that there is an amount of $5,000 included in the contract consideration, for some administrative and legal activities undertaken by the lessor in connection with the lease arrangement. IFRS 16 states that, a contract may include an amount payable to the lessor by the lessee, for activities and costs that do not transfer a good or service to the lessee. This is the case here. These administrative and legal activities do not transfer a good or a service to the lessee, and therefore, they should not give rise to a separate component of the contract. However, the cost of these activities should be kept as a part of the total consideration, that is to be allocated to the separately identified components of the contract. Now, let us talk about a practical expedient that is available under IFRS 16. If you see here in the schedule, the non-lease component is presented separately from the lease components. But sometimes, it might not be practical to separate lease components from non-lease components, and that is when the data required to separate the components is not available, or when the non-lease components are immaterial compared to the lease component, and the benefit to be gained from the separation does not justify the cost and efforts involved. So IFRS 16 here gives the lessee, and not the lessor, an option to apply a practical expedient. With this practical expedient, the The lessee can elect to account for the lease component and the related non-lease components, as a single component, and account for this component using IFRS 16. So back to our example, and let us assume that the lessee elects to apply the practical expedient. The non-lease component will not be presented separately. So let us take out the non-lease component from the schedule, and instead, insert 50,000, which is the share of each lease components from the security and maintenance, as given in the example. Then, calculate the totals here, then the percentages of each component from the total figure. By applying these percentages to the consideration in the contract, we arrive at the share of each lease component with the related non-lease component from the contract consideration. This election can be made for all classes of assets leased by the lessee, or only for selected classes. That is all about the allocation of the contract consideration from the lessee's perspective. The allocation of the contract consideration from the lessor's perspective is beyond the scope of this course, and shall be addressed in a future course that will cover IFRS 15. Now let us go for a quiz.